Hey guys, we're ready to start chapter 5. So you should be on page 119, ready to take some notes about our first case study, which is called The Dung of the Devil. And this is about plants versus disease. So using different plants from around the world in order to combat disease. So in 1918 until about 1920, there was a kind of an epidemic that went through Spain. They called it the Spanish flu, and it killed between 20 and 100 million people. Now, in China, during around the same time, they were using this plant, okay, called the dung of the devil, that treated flu. Okay, and so what they found, kind of through different genetic tests and things like that, is that the same Spanish flu that killed so many people in the early 1900s is the same virus, the H1N1 virus, that went through more recently, 2009 and 2010, and we call it the swine flu. And they actually use the same plant in order to make the antiviral medication for people who had the swine flu in 2009-2010 that they used in China to combat Spanish flu. All right, so what we want to learn from this case study is that there are, some plants that we haven't even identified in the deepest parts of rainforests, and you never know when they might be able to be used for medicinal purposes or any other ecosystem service that we talked about in chapter 3. So the moral of the story is to save biodiversity, okay? So we don't want to be just randomly chopping down rainforests, because you never know what you're going to chop down along with the trees. Okay, maybe it's a bug, maybe it's a plant, maybe it's a moss that's a little bit different species that could cure cancer or AIDS or any of these other epidemic diseases that we still have around today. All right, so what the heck is biodiversity? So biodiversity is basically biological diversity, and it comes in kind of 3 steps. So we have ecosystem diversity, which is if you take, for example, the United States. We have a lot of different ecosystems, a lot of different biomes in the United States, and so we know that we have a large ecosystem diversity because it's the variety of ecosystems within a given area. All right, and then if we go down a level, we get to species diversity, so the variety of species within a given ecosystem. So for example, we know that in a rainforest, the species diversity is very, very high. There's a lot of plant species, animal species, fungi species, insect species. But something like a desert does not have as much species diversity because it only has cactus and lizards and things that are especially adapted to live there. All right, and then our last level that goes really far down is genetic diversity, which you probably remember from biology. And so this is the variety of genes within a given species. So within a population, over here we have our ecosystem diversity is on the coastline. So we have our ocean ecosystem, we have our river ecosystem, we have our kind of temperate forest ecosystem here, and then we have our alpine ecosystem up here at the top of the mountains here. And so this area has a large ecosystem diversity because we have 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 over here at this desert because of the rain shadow. So 5 ecosystems in a small area, so that's probably high ecosystem diversity. Species diversity, here's a forest, lots of diversity there. We have our bird species, mammal species, lots of different flowering plants, ferns, moss, fungi, really high diversity here. And then we have our genetic diversity. So let's look at these different animals. And so this is one species. I'm going to guess it's like a chipmunk. or something similar to that. And we know from humans that we don't have all the same DNA. Okay? Humans have very high genetic diversity because we have so many individuals, okay, that are so distantly related. Okay, now whether or not you believe in a common ancestor or not, there are still large populations, because one of our morals of this chapter is going to be that individuals do not evolve, populations evolve. Okay, so, and that helps when there's a lot of this genetic diversity, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So, this chipmunk has green genes, this chipmunk has orange genes, this chipmunk has blue genes, and if like these two guys mate, then their babies are going to have a mixture between blue and green. Alright, and then if orange mates with somebody else, then those babies have a mix, all the way down into different generations. So the bigger the original population, the more genetic diversity. Alright, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a little bit. So, how many species live on Earth? Alright, so, I mean, this is an extremely difficult question to answer. Alright, so species, if you remember from chapter 1, it's going to be our distinct group of organisms that share characteristics distinct from other groups and can produce viable offspring. So that viable offspring part is really important because, for example, if you mate a horse and a donkey, you will get a mule, but a mule is not able to reproduce. Okay, and that's because horses and donkeys are not the same species. Kind of like a liger. You mix a lion and a tiger, you get a liger. Can't reproduce because they're not the same species. Okay, so interspecies breeding does happen, but the only way you can call a population the same species is if they can reproduce and have viable offspring. Alright, so what scientists do is they measure the number of species in an area to check on biodiversity. So this happens all over the world at all sorts of times. The number of species in the world is a hard number to know. We've currently named approximately 2 million species. So we know that we found and identified, and it's all in a book of species. We've currently named about 2 million of those species. Now, scientists have estimated that it's about 10 million total. So we are still missing names for about 8 million species. And so this is why biodiversity is important. This is why keeping habitats intact and natural is so important, because what if these species go extinct without us even knowing them? Alright, so we know about extinction, we know about the dodo and things like that, but there could be species that have lived that we don't even know about. Okay, so next we have species richness and species evenness. So let's see what those mean. Okay, these are going to be really important to your pre-lab for your parking lot lab. So you want to make sure that you have the sticky note ready to go. Alright, so species richness and evenness. As you probably know, if you've ever walked in the forest or even down the road, the species on Earth are not even or uniform. Okay, unless you go to like a Christmas tree farm or like a cornfield or something like that, the distribution is not going to be even. Alright, so we have to measure biodiversity in other ways, and so we use these two measures of biodiversity: species richness and species evenness. So species richness is the number of species in a given area. Do you have one species of corn in a cornfield, or do you have 100,000 species in a forest? Okay, so obviously species richness is going to be higher in a forest. Now, species evenness is going to be the relative proportion of different species in a given area. So my example for this is that I have a Christmas tree farm. It's going to have low richness and low evenness because there's really only 1 or 2 species, and they kind of dominate. So if you have too much of one species, they have dominance over the ecosystem, and so your evenness is low. Now, a rainforest, they're going to have high richness and high evenness. Not one species is going to really dominate. Okay, so if we look at this figure down here. It's going to be kind of important for you to know. So community 1, we have 25% of this A species, 25% of this B species of tree, 25% of C, and 25% of D. Okay, so over here we have the same tree, we have 70%, and then 10, 10, 10. Alright, so according to our counts of biodiversity, species richness, number of species in a given area, this has 4 and this has 4. So they have the same species richness, but it's all about evenness. Okay? So it says, species richness and species evenness are 2 different measures of species diversity. Although both communities contain the same number of species, which is 4, community 1 has a more even distribution of species and is therefore more diverse than community 2. So if we wanted to think about this, like which one has a higher biodiversity, it's going to be community 1 because it's more evenly distributed between the different number of species. This community is dominated by species A. Okay, so it's going to have an inherently lower biodiversity index than community 1. And what I mean by biodiversity index, we're going to measure that tomorrow outside in the parking lot. Alright, last page. Now, what are we as humans doing to these measures of species evenness and richness? So what happens when we disturb an area? Usually we decrease the evenness and we decrease the richness. We like to cut down trees. We like to level out all the soil and build houses and parking lots, and all of those things are going to decrease the richness and decrease the evenness. Because usually when we plant, like our yards, we plant one species of grass and then maybe some roses or some other pretty flowers. But if you look at a human area, usually the plant species are all the same, the tree species are all the same. We like uniformity for some reason as humans, and so when we clear land in order to build houses and things like that, we decrease both of these measures of biodiversity. Now, why do we care? Knowing evenness and richness establishes a baseline. So we want to be able to do comparisons of like now versus 20 years ago versus 50 years from now. A lot of environmental science is about measuring change over time. Like it's not as important to know what's happening right at this moment. It's important for us to compare that to like last year or 5 years ago. Like how are these biodiversity things changing? Okay, and that matters to us because if we're tracking things like extinctions and those kinds of things, it's going to be very important to know how far we've come from where we used to be. Okay. Now the last thing we're going to talk about today is a phylogeny, and those are these cool little like evolutionary trees. Okay, and so phylogenies are branches of evolutionary relationships, and so our chapter 5 is evolution of biodiversity, so we're going to talk a lot about how these different species came about. Okay, so these are kind of based on things that these different species have in common. Okay, so right now we're at the present. We have these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different species here in the present. We have the lancelet, the lamprey, the trout, lizard, and chipmunk. All right, and so then what is happening at all of these branch points are that if we go back in time to this common ancestor to all descendants, so the common ancestor among all of these species way back when, okay, so the ancestor had this thing called a notochord, and it's kind of a precursor to like a spine. And so the lancelet still has just the notochord. Like he doesn't have a vertebra or a hinged jaw or a forelegs or a mammary glands. He just has a notochord, very similar to the common ancestor. Okay, so this branch point indicates where speciation event took place. So one species gave rise to 2 or more new species. So the lancelet came about, and then this new species that had a vertebrae or a backbone came about. All right, and so a lamprey is a species that has a vertebra. All right, but that's about the extent of his evolutionary gains. Okay, and then we have another branch point where this hinged jaw thing came about. So, you know how you can move your jaw and you can open it and close it? Okay, lamprey has kind of a sucker face thing, and the lancelet, I'm not sure how they eat. Okay, if you're interested, you are more than welcome to Google. So this guy is going to be the common ancestor of trout, lizard, and chipmunk. Okay, so he came, and the trout is very similar to him. He has a hinged jaw, and he has a vertebra, and he has a spinal cord. Okay, and then evolution kept going, and we had this thing called four legs, and so this could be in the water or on land, but four legs evolved. Okay, so here's the common ancestor between the lizard and the chipmunk. And so the lizard is going to be more similar to this ancestor than the chipmunk, because after four legs evolved, then these things called mammary glands evolved, and that's the mammary glands are what produces milk. And so all mammals have a common ancestor with a mammary gland and four legs and a hinged jaw and a vertebra and a spinal cord. Okay, so this is the quote-unquote most highly evolved species on this phylogeny. This is the kind of least evolved, or the most basic animal. Okay, so we have 3 questions to answer tonight. You should be on page 123. Don't forget to check out the awesome extra videos if you are confused about anything in here. And I will see you tomorrow for our awesome parking lot lab.